Death is the only certainty we have, and paradoxically, it is the only certainty we cannot understand. We live trying to domesticate it, hide it in hospitals, turn grief into silence. But as Arthur Schopenhauer said, dying is the true genius of humanity. It reveals to us the nothingness that we are and the will that moves us. Death, for him, is not an accident of fate, but the most authentic point of existence, the liberation from desire. Schopenhauer believed that the world is driven by a blind, irrational force that he called will, an energy that pushes us toward life, toward desire, toward the relentless search for something that is never complete. And it is precisely this will that condemns us to suffering, because to desire is, in essence, not to be satisfied. We live in search of what we don't have, and when we do, the pleasure is short-lived, soon replaced by another emptiness. For Schopenhauer, to die is then to cease this will. It is to rest from life. In The World as Will and Representation, he writes, "Death is the great opportunity to free oneself from the will. What disappears is not the being, but the individual, the illusion of separation." From this perspective, death is a return, not a disappearance. It is as if the being dissolved again into the hole from which it came. There is no heaven, hell, or reincarnation, only the cessation of the illusion of individuality. For Schopenhauer's pessimism, the end is also relief. And perhaps for this reason, his philosophy rings so desperately true in times like ours, where modern man, even surrounded by comfort, remains unhappy. But then along comes Nietzsche, the man who refused to accept surrender. While Schopenhauer said, "Deny life to free yourself from suffering," Nietzsche shouted, "Love your fate, even if it is death." In The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote, "The thought of death gives life more weight, more depth. Whoever learned to die, learned to live." For him, denying suffering is denying one's own existence. Death is not the end of the will, but the proof that we live intensely. Nietzsche saw death as the mirror of life, a constant reminder that every moment should be lived as if it were eternal, even though we know it will end. There is a little quoted story about Nietzsche. Once, while visiting an abandoned battlefield, he saw the trail of death and wrote in his diary something that echoes to this day. "Life is beautiful because it is transitory. Eternity, if it existed, would be unbearable." This phrase sums up his challenge to death. Not to fear it, but to integrate it. While Schopenhauer saw death as liberation from pain, Nietzsche saw it as the consecration of courage, the last act of life. He proposed the concept of the eternal return, where everything repeats itself endlessly, every joy, every pain, every loss. The question he asks is brutal. If I had to live this life, with all its pains, infinitely many times, would you still want it? This question is not about time, but about meaning. Those who love life enough to repeat it eternally, accepting even death as part of it, finally understand what freedom is. Because to live, according to Nietzsche, is to say yes to the tragic. It is to face the abyss and continue dancing over it. Between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche there is a broken mirror. One sees death as liberation from suffering, the other as a celebration of existence. But both meet at the same point. Death reveals who we really are. In a world that idolizes youth and fears the end, this reflection is almost unbearable. Perhaps this is why we avoid talking about death, because it denounces the farce of our psychological immortality, the theater of forever in which we insist on believing. And that's where suffering makes sense. Death, deep down, is the silent teacher of life. It forces us to choose what's worth keeping and what's just noise. It erases the superfluous and leaves the essential. As Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you have to have chaos inside you to generate a dancing star. Death is this chaos. It is the limit that transforms fear into lucidity and pain into consciousness. Without it, nothing would have value. With it, everything becomes urgent. In the end, perhaps Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were talking about the same thing, with opposite languages. Death is not an end, it is a mirror that gives man back his most intimate truth, that to live is to die a little every day. There is a death that everyone knows, the biological one, the one that encloses the body. But there is another, more subtle, more cruel, the death that dwells in silence within us. To die a little bit every time we lose someone, a love, a dream, a version of who we were. Psychoanalysis calls these small psychic deaths, and it is in them that Freud and Jung found the hidden skeleton of the human soul. After all, the fear of death isn't just the fear of the end of life. It's the fear of losing what makes us feel alive. Sigmund Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, made a discovery that shocked the world. Inside us there is something stronger than the instinct to live. He called this the death drive, Todestrieb. According to him, human beings do not only seek pleasure, but also, unconsciously, self-destruction. It is as if there were, in each one, a silent force that wants to return to the state of absolute rest, to the nothingness from which we came. Freud writes, "The goal of all life is death. Life is just a detour on the way to it." This idea is not morbid. It is revealing. Man lives between two impulses. Eros, the force that creates, and Thanatos, the one that destroys. These two ancient gods still inhabit every human gesture. The love that heals and the love that hurts, the desire to build and the pleasure to destroy. And it is from this tension that the tragedy of existence is born. Freud realized that the fear of death is often the fear of accepting one's own vulnerability. That's why we create defenses, religions, beliefs, traditions. All promise a continuity, an after, that denies emptiness. And it is in this denial that the collective illusion of immortality rests. A real and tragic example of this is the way humanity reacts to loss. At funerals, we try to rationalize the irrational. We say, he went to a better place, God wanted it that way. One day we will meet again. But deep down, these phrases are defense mechanisms. Freud would say that it is the unconscious trying to rewrite the unbearable, because to face nothingness would be to go mad. However, Carl Jung went beyond Freud. If Freud saw death as the return to the inorganic, Jung saw it as transformation. For him, the unconscious is not just a deposit of trauma, but a symbolic universe that speaks through images, dreams, and archetypes. And among these archetypes, death occupies a sacred place. In memories, dreams, reflections, Jung recounts his own near-death experience. "I saw the earth in the distance, bathed in a bluish light. I felt free, weightless, as if I had left everything human behind. I was about to enter something immensely vast, but a doctor called me back. I felt a deep sadness when I came back to life." This confession changes everything. Death, for Jung, is a passage, not an annihilation. He believed that the unconscious carries memories that go beyond time and the body, what he called the collective unconscious. In this symbolic space, death is not the end, but a change of form. The butterfly, the autumn, the sunset, all of these symbols reflect the natural wisdom of the end that brings about rebirth. Jung stated that the human psyche seeks totality, and death is the apex of this integration. Life has no meaning without death. Death completes the circle. Think about the cycle of nature. The leaves that fall in autumn are not failures. They are part of the same process that will allow spring to bloom. But modern man has forgotten this rhythm. We live as if the cycle were a straight line. Born, grow, consume, win, and suddenly silence. Death becomes a mistake, a scandal, when in fact it is the only guaranteed event. A painful example. A mother who loses a child and spends years visiting the grave, talking to the void. Psychoanalysis does not judge this gesture. She understands him. The unconscious refuses absence because inside the mind, the dead are still alive. The dream is the psyche's attempt to sew what has been torn. Therefore, many repeatedly dream of loved ones who have passed away. It is not madness. It is the unconscious trying to reconcile itself with the reality of death. Freud would say, "Mourning is the price of love." Jung would add, "But it is love that gives meaning to mourning." The pain of loss is the most honest proof that we have experienced something real. And maybe that's why, deep down, all nostalgia is a form of eternity. Both Freud and Jung converge on one point. Death lives within the mind. It is in every fear, in every dream of falling, in every feeling that time is slipping away. And only when we look at it head-on do we truly begin to mature. There is an instant, right after the death of someone we love, when the world seems to lose its shape. The colors pale, time drags on, and the silence becomes too heavy. It is in this empty space, between the last breath and the morning, that faith is born, not as certainty, but as necessity. Death is the border where reason is silent and the spirit begins to speak. And few have understood this as deeply as Søren Kierkegaard and Saint Augustine. For Kierkegaard, the father of Christian existentialism, death is the mirror where man confronts the absurdity of his own existence. We live in despair, not because we're going to die, but because we pretend we won't. In human despair, he writes, "The greatest danger is not to die, but to continue living dead." The phrase carries an existential poison. Many are already dead in life, anesthetized by routine, vanity, fear. Death, for Kierkegaard, is not only biological, it is spiritual. It is the moment when man must decide whether to continue running away from himself or whether he will dare to face infinity. He believed that despair is the inevitable path to God. When man realizes that nothing earthly can fill the emptiness he feels, despair pushes him to the leap of faith, an irrational leap where there are no guarantees, only surrender. Faith is just that, believing in the absurd, because the absurd is what remains when reason is exhausted. Fear and trembling, Kierkegaard. Death, then, is the purest expression of this absurdity. It is the place where all logic collapses, and the human being, bare of meaning, is forced to trust in something, in someone, or in nothing. But the paradox is this: only when we accept that we do not control life do we really begin to live it. While Kierkegaard saw death as the cry of the human spirit in the face of the infinite, Saint Augustine saw it as the return to the love that created us. In Confessions, he mourns the death of a friend and writes, "The soul longs for thee, O God, and is restless until it resteth in thee." This restlessness is the mark of mortality. Augustine saw death as the consequence of original sin, the separation between man and the Creator. But he also saw in it the promise of redemption. Death, for him, is the price of exile and the way back to the Father's house. He believed that within every human pain there is a vestige of the divine. Even when we suffer, it is God's love that calls us back home. This vision transforms suffering, and even death, into part of a larger plan, a design that the mind does not understand, but the heart senses. There is something profoundly human about this contradiction. We desire heaven, but we fear dying. We ask for eternity, but we can't stand the wait. Man, as Kierkegaard said, lives in constant anguish because he carries within himself the infinite and tries in vain to fill it with the finite. Think of the war fields, the hospitals, the goodbyes that didn't have a chance. Faith is born precisely in those places where reason breaks down. One does not have to believe in God to feel the power of the transcendent. It is enough to have loved someone to the point that the world seems unbearable without that person. Because love, this desire to eternalize the other, is the most intimate proof that we cannot stand the idea of nothingness. Kierkegaard called this the anguish of freedom. We are beings condemned to choice. We can believe or give up, and it is this freedom that makes us tragic. Faith is a leap over the abyss, and death is the abyss that calls us. For Saint Augustine, this leap is the reunion. For Kierkegaard, it is courage in the face of the absurd. In both, there is a common truth. Death does not destroy meaning, it reveals it. Faith, then, is not a denial of death. It is the acceptance that the mystery is greater than ourselves. The soul, Augustine said, is immortal not because it resists death, but because it is born of the love that does not die. And perhaps that is why, in front of a tomb, many do not pray for mercy. They pray for reunion. Because deep down, as Kierkegaard would say, those who learn to die, learn to believe. For centuries, it was believed that death was simple. The heart stopped, the brain went out, and the human being ceased to exist. But modern science has begun to realize something that dismantles this ancient certainty. Dying is not an instant. It is a process. Studies conducted in recent decades, such as those by cardiologist Dr. Sam Parnia of New York University, show that consciousness can remain active until minutes after cardiac arrest. In his Awareness During Resuscitation project, he interviewed hundreds of people who were clinically killed and then revived. Many reported vivid perceptions. They heard conversations, they saw lights, they felt out of their body, and some were able to describe details of the environment during the period in which, theoretically, they were unconscious. These accounts challenge the classical materialist model, which states that the mind is merely the product of brain activity. If consciousness continues for a few minutes after the brain shuts down, what exactly is consciousness? Traditional neuroscience answers. It's electrical waste, random discharges. But there is a problem. In several cases, brain activity was totally absent. And yet, the experience was lucid, coherent, and emotionally intense. Neuroscientist Stuart Hameroff of the University of Arizona, alongside physicist Roger Penrose, proposed the orchestrated theory of objective reduction, orchestra-OR. According to them, consciousness can emerge from quantum processes within the microtubules of brain cells. That is, part of the human mind could exist at a subatomic level, outside of traditional space-time, which would explain why certain experiences seem to transcend the body. It's an audacious hypothesis, but it opens a dangerous and fascinating door. What if consciousness does not die with the brain? Other scientists, such as Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who lived through a near-death experience, NDE, report something similar. After 7 days in a deep coma, with zero brain activity, he described sights, sounds, and sensations of absolute peace. After recovering, he wrote in Proof of Heaven, 2012, "Consciousness is the greatest mystery of the universe. Death does not erase it, it only frees it." Skeptics claim that these experiences are illusions created by a collapsing brain, chemical hallucinations produced by a lack of oxygen. And indeed, there is scientific basis for this. The neurotransmitter DMT, found naturally in the human body, is released in large quantities during birth, deep sleep, and death. This compound can generate intense visions, a sense of unity and transcendence, which may explain the light at the end of the tunnel reported by so many. But there's a catch. DMT doesn't explain the organized, verifiable content of many near-death experiences. How to explain blind people by describing exact visual scenes during cardiac arrest, or children reporting memories from other times with confirmable details? Science is slowly beginning to admit that consciousness is more complex than the brain can contain. Physicist Erwin Schrödinger, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, once said, "Consciousness is unique. There is no multiplicity of minds. There is only one mind, shared by all." This idea echoes the older philosophical and spiritual views. Schopenhauer's, Jung's, the Eastern mystics, who saw individuality as an illusion. What we call I would be only a temporary expression of a universal consciousness. Death, then, would not be destruction, but reintegration. Modern neuropsychology is also beginning to observe that the fear of death profoundly influences human behavior. The terror management theory, TMT, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piszczynski, shows that much of culture, religions, art, morality, and even the pursuit of status emerges as defense mechanisms against the dread of finitude. We live trying to immortalize our name, our body, our achievements. Every selfie, every legacy, every monument is an unconscious attempt to cheat death. But there is a paradox. The more we try to avoid the idea of death, the more we move away from the real experience of life. This is what Freud already intuited with the death drive, and what Jung confirmed when he said that the repressed shadow returns. To deny death is to deny half of who we are. Today, cognitive science is beginning to rediscover the philosophy it tried to bury. Research with deep meditation, out-of-body experiences, and altered states of consciousness reveals patterns similar to those reported in NDEs. A sense of unity, loss of sense of time, dissolution of the ego. The difference is that now all of this can be measured by electrodes, MRIs, and algorithms. But the mystery remains intact. The question, deep down, has never been whether there is life after death, but what is life before it? Because if consciousness transcends the body, then living is a school, and death is only graduation. Biology calls the end what may be just the beginning of another kind of existence. When we look at everything, from Schopenhauer to Jung, from Kierkegaard to quantum physics, we notice a pattern. No one can kill the idea of continuity. Whether by faith, theory, or direct experience, the human being intuits that there is something that remains.